I'm Anthony, and I work alongside Bobby to my right. We are both with Bernalillo County Natural Resource Services. We are both natural resource scientists, and we are both certified water harvesting practitioners. So it's one of our favorite topics to cover, and we're glad you could all join us today. Do you want to add anything?
Just looking forward to talking to everyone and thank you for attending this workshop.
Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing. I'll get there.
Minimize the teams. There we go. Cool.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, real quick background on Bernalillo County Natural Resource Services. So we are part of the Public Works Department, and Natural Resource Services, one of the many things we do is education and outreach, specifically on the protection and conservation of the county's natural resource services. So the goal for today specifically is we will present an introduction on passive rainwater harvesting as a tool for New Mexico residents who want beautiful water-saving landscapes. All right, quick agenda for the next 45 minutes or so. We are going to cover, first of all, what is rainwater harvesting? We're going to move on to basic design elements. So if you want to install something in your yard, we'll tell you the tips and tricks about how to start that. 3, we'll talk about installation, things to expect and plan for that. And then finally, we'll touch on maintenance of passive rainwater harvesting systems. With the time we have today, we're not going to be able to go super in depth on any one of these large items. However, we certainly encourage you to go to our berncode.gov/rainwater. That is a website where we have a rainwater harvesting field guide pictured in the bottom corner there. We have videos, we have other guidance documents that all go in quite detailed depth on each one of these topics. The resources on that webpage, including the water harvesting guide, were created several years back by a lot of our collaborators that we partner with externally from the county. So really reputable rainwater harvesting experts that are in our area, so the greater Albuquerque area. Some of those partners are CUDAD, Soil and Water Conservation District, the Arid Lid Coalition, Rocky Mountain Youth Corps helped us do installations, Hunter Tinbrook, a local with Waterwise Landscaping, Judith Phillip, a local author, Jim Brooks, a local installer, Tess Houle, landscape design, and Sarah Herteau from Integrated Biological Solutions. So just wanted to give them a shout out for helping us create all of this material that we're pulling from today. All right, pop quiz. This is how you're going to get your rebate. No, I'm just kidding. How much annual rainfall does Albuquerque receive? Give you a second to think about it. If you said 10 inches of rain, you are mostly correct. However, I like to think about it in a slightly different way, and that is to say that Albuquerque gets 31 billion gallons of rain per year. So the way I got that number is I simply took 10 inches of annual rain, multiplied it by the surface area of our city, and the number that comes out is 31 billion gallons. So it's an impressive number. And if it sounds impressive, it should be, because if you put that in context, the Water Authority provided 29 billion gallons of potable water to its customers last year. So every time in town we turned on the tap, we flushed a toilet. All of that was coming from, that high quality water that's provided to drinking water quality standards. But all that was still less than what we received in annual rainfall, which I think is a really interesting way, because we live in a desert. by nature, we do get a meager amount of annual precipitation. But if you just think about it in terms of really what we do get, yes, we have drought years, we have wet years. So it's great that the Water Authority has these different sources of water, groundwater, surface water that we're pulling from to get us through those drought periods. But it's really astounding. And if you just think about it, like, yes, we're a desert, but we actually, Brad Lancaster, the famous water harvesting author, says, don't think about it as a scarcity problem, but rather an abundance problem. How can we best put to use the rainfall that is actually quite an impressive number? So just wanted to share that as a fun aside. So let's talk about definitions. What is rainwater harvesting? Simply put, rainwater harvesting is a method to collect and store rainwater. We have active rainwater harvesting. So to the left of the screen, you'll see an example of that. And that is the collection of rainwater in rain barrels, also called cisterns or tanks. And the reason it's called active is because the user, the homeowner, needs to take action to distribute that water to the garden or to the plants or whatever the use may be. Today, we're going to talk about the other side of the coin, passive rainwater harvesting. So that is collecting rainwater, not in a barrel, but just straight into the earth, infiltrating that water into the soil, where the end result is that's where plant roots are. So it's directing and capturing rainwater, whether it's from a roof, like so that you see on the right side of the screen here, the blue arrows are indicating, okay, every time it rains, that rainwater is hitting these impervious surfaces that we've built up in our urban environment, whether it's a roof or a sidewalk or a street. Well, that rain has to go somewhere. If we direct it to low points in our yard, so places where it can gather and slow down and sink into the soil, that then becomes a resource for those plant roots, which of course is how they are taking up water and nutrients through the root zone in the soil. And so that is passive rainwater harvesting in a nutshell. And then I would add, like, I am a fan of rain barrels. I think they're a great tool. If used properly, they can save thousands of gallons for an individual homeowner over the course of a year. But maintenance concerns with a rain barrel, they clog, they might freeze during the winter. If they're installed improperly, they can become a mosquito concern. So we consider passive rainwater harvesting to really be necessary for any rainwater harvesting system, because if you look on that picture to the left, those barrels are going to overflow like that previous slide. You saw that big monsoon deluge. Well, what happens when your barrels are overflowing? Send it to the landscape, because that's going to hold much more water in the soil than you ever could capture in a barrel. So what does passive rainwater harvesting look like? It comes in all shapes and sizes, but here are two pictures that we really like that illustrate the beauty and the diversity of what these systems can look like, particularly when it comes to both native and drought-adapted plant species. So everything, more than not everything in this picture, is a plant that is able to thrive in our desert environment. So picture to the left is showing, when you see rock in a rainwater harvesting system, that usually indicates that water is flowing from a high point from the left into the arrows down into those rocks. And then what those rocks do is they slow that down and they slowly move the water through the system. Again, as it slows, it sinks into the soil. Those plant roots are taking advantage of it. So to the right, if I were to see this, if I were to be visiting this site to the right in person, I would, first of all, I'd be thinking that you've got a lot of different plants here. It looks like it's an ash tree hanging down above our head. And it's a really beautiful, really diverse, and really functional landscape. But the rule of thumb in Albuquerque is that we spend 40% of our potable drinking water on irrigation. So if you can have this kind of a great, beautiful landscape and you're using rainwater harvesting to water it, and the whole city did that, it's like we do not have to sacrifice having these great functional, beautiful landscapes. Um, we do not have to sacrifice that with rainwater harvesting. Okay, so we talked about sort of the water conservation benefit of water harvesting, but it also has many other benefits too. And this is depicted in the schematic to the left, whereby in the lower left of the picture, it is meant to be a city street. So again, when that rain hits the impervious street, it just runs down. Oftentimes it'll pool, creates a nuisance, creates erosion downstream. So if you can instead divert that into the city right-of-ways, into some planting areas, the number one benefit that Bobby works with a lot at the county here is stormwater quality. So instead of that stormwater picking up that oil, picking up that grease, trash, plastic, and then just sending it to the Rio Grande, how can we instead divert it, capture it on site where that stormwater quality will be treated as it enters the soil. Microbial activity in the soil actually does help to improve the quality of that storm water. And again, it's providing extra water for street trees, shrubs. That creates habitat for bugs, birds, and it helps with the urban heat island effect. So, dozens of sort of stacking effects that you can get with these systems. To the right, Bobby took this great photo of green stormwater infrastructure, which is just another way to say water harvesting in the streetscape. So you can see depicted by the arrows, water coming down the street, and instead of just flowing straight to the next storm drain that's going to shoot that water straight to the river, instead it's allowed to enter this natural soil medium, be taken up by plants. And this rainbow is not photoshopped, so I think we could say that rainbows may also be a extra benefit for rainwater harvesting. Okay, so over a city scale, water harvesting can create a lot of benefits. And so now, if you're thinking, I want to join the party and I want to install one of these systems at my house, how can I get started on doing that? Well, we'll walk you through site assessment, sizing your basins, and plant selection. And those will be the sort of the three topics that we'll cover when you're planning your water harvesting design. So site assessment should be the first thing you consider when you are moving into your own design. And that's just simply looking at your space, whether it's your yard, front yard, backyard, or maybe you volunteer at your community garden and you've got a tool shed, and that tool shed is spitting water off the roof and that's going somewhere. Well, that's a resource. So it's just really thoughtfully observing what's going on in your space, how it's interacting with the world. So when it rains, do you look out the window and put on a raincoat, better yet, and go and watch where that water is hitting your space and where it's going? Is it flowing just straight from your roof down your carport and then into the street? And if so, can that be a resource? And how do you capture that? And how do you divert that water into a space that's going to be beneficial? Even just noticing how the sun moves across your yard during different times of the year. Is it creating these hot microclimates that you think like, well, okay, I want to be able to take that hot microclimate and either shade it or use it beneficially for some other, maybe I want a cactus garden and that's where I can locate in the hottest part of the yard, that's where I can put my cactus. So all these things, sort of thinking about the interacting effects of your space and how it interacts with the water cycle, and then even more so how it interacts with, things like a social space. Like, is there a place in your yard where you like to gather? Well, maybe you want to put a tree there to shade that space. And then thinking about sort of what's the word? Constraints, site constraints. So above ground utilities, underground utilities, sort of planning for that. So the last bullet point on the left here, originally that read be aware of underground utilities. But instead, I was kind of thinking like, okay, how can we turn that into an opportunity? Maybe you can use where your gas line is. You're not going to be digging or planting anything on top of that. Maybe that's where you put your gathering space, or maybe that's where you walk out to your mailbox, so on and so forth. So it's just thinking about how to optimize your every aspect of your space um, to the greatest degree. And a great illustration, and I'm just going to bring this up because Bobby brought this to my attention when we were looking at this graphic together. In the top right corner, you can see that cactus. I'll have my cursor above it here. Well, let's say we're in Albuquerque and this cactus is receiving 10 inches of rain. Well, if you were to instead take measures to send this water into the planted area where this cactus is, well, you just doubled the surface area where that water is collecting and being stored in the soil for that cactus. So now where you had 10 inches of rain, now you have 20 inches of rain, and that's what we get on the top of Sandia, and that would be enough water for you to grow that shade tree, to shade that picnic table, so on and so forth. So yeah, thoughtful observation of your site. So you've done your site assessment. You sort of know where you want to put your rainwater harvesting features. The next question you may ask yourself is, how big do I want to make these things? Do I want to make these features in these low spots? So there is no right or wrong answer to this question. It will depend on how much space you have. It may depend on the amount of water you want to collect for one reason or another. But I do encourage you to run through the math to do it, because the more you know about your system, the more opportunities that are going to come to light. And so if you go to in the lower right hand screen there, you'll see again that on our rainwater harvesting website, we've got a calculator that tries to make this process as simple as possible for you. I will say that if it's math that I can do, I know it's math that anyone on this call could do. So the way the calculator works is you'll get the surface area of whatever you're collecting. So in this case, it's a roof, 1,800 square feet, and it's all draining to one location in this scenario. And then you will multiply that square footage by a runoff coefficient. That's item number 2 here. And that just means that we're not expecting to capture 100% of that rain. Maybe we expect that 90% of the rain that hits that roof will capture. So that's the 0.9 there. If you had a gravel and tar roof, something that doesn't drain so readily, maybe that's 0.8 for your coefficient. Next, you can select your rainstorm size. So, again, there's no right answer to this. It's going to depend on your space and what you want to accomplish. But a good rule of thumb is, how can I make my design such that it can capture the 1-inch rain event? And the reason for that is essentially a 1-inch rain event is a pretty decent sized storm. So it's going to give you a lot of water. But most of our rain events in the Southwest, in Albuquerque, are actually much less than 1 inch of rain. And so if you design for that, you're going to be capturing most every rain event that occurs outside of our big events. And so the calculator will spit out a number for you, 1,005 gallons. And if you ask me, that is a pretty impressive number. It's the same logic of our pop quiz slide, where it's like, okay, 1 inch of rain doesn't really sound like that much, but if you multiply it over the area of your roof, all of a sudden your rain barrel is overflowing many times over. So again, how can you capture the most amount of water? Rain barrels are great, but really the soil is the ultimate reservoir. Okay. Now, if you don't like math and you fear that you just want to get your hands and get a project going, I'd totally encourage that too. So we wanted to share just some quick examples of rainwater harvesting that involves no math. However, it did involve some in the case of Bobby's yard here, some thoughtful observation. So this is Bobby's house that we're looking at, and he noticed that on the left picture here, as water was hitting his driveway, it was sort of heading towards that little planter area in the landscape between his and his neighbor's house. But that area was raised so that when the water hit it, it would essentially just act as a bumper and come out to the street, again, avoiding that free, precious resource from the sky. So what did Bobby do? Went ahead, took a shovel out, dug down, and added some mulch in there. And all of a sudden, what was a water wasting landscape, just what did that take you? A couple minutes. I don't know.
Couple hours.
Couple hours. Okay. But anyway, so he's captured. So just the observation and noticing, simple design, but really big impact. Um, and I also wanted to share my own little project again, not overthinking it, no math involved. I was working at a house one day and I noticed like, oh my gosh, you got a pretty big roof and it's all draining to this gutter and downspout system. And the elbow, as you see on the left picture, was just spilling that water out onto the asphalt driveway and then downhill. This was a considerable hill and out onto the street. And we got this great big tree behind us that was acting as like honeybee activity actually. And so I just thought, let's unscrew your elbow, turn it around 180 degrees, and all that water is now going to your landscape. There's more things you could do to augment that rainwater capture, but just the simple act of flipping that gutter elbow, I think, and sending it to the landscape was a huge, huge improvement. Okay, plant selection. So the theme that you've probably been picking up on is that in these systems, what does best is, of course, drought tolerant and native plants. Similarly, on our burnco.gov website, we have a plant list. And this is a list that was, again, local experts helped us compile plants that can thrive with in our desert climate with minimal rainfall. And it's got 120 species on there. And if you go to this guide, it's going to give you a real good start. I think this is a good sort of tandem resource with the Xeriscape guide that Amos shared at the beginning, where this is going to give you rainwater specific plants, over 120 of them, grasses, trees, shrubs. And then, if you want more information on them, you can use the Water Authority's resources. But it basically walks you through, okay, if I dug a low spot in my yard, what could I put on the side of it where it's going to get the least amount of rain? And then all the way through to the bottom of the low point where it's going to be receiving the most amount of rain. So it kind of walks you through those biome considerations, small scale considerations as well. And I think it's a great resource if you're starting to devise a plant palette for your property. I'm going to pass to you, Bobby.
Cool. Well, thank you, Anthony, for that great introduction into the topic. And I'm going to kind of jump into installation. So you've thought about your property, you've taken some time and observed how water moves across the landscape, how the sun moves across the landscape, and you want to get your hands dirty and you want to go dig. If you're already aware of those constraints, now's a really good time of year to go do an installation and planting. Temperatures are cooler, it's not as hot, it's more enjoyable to be outside right now. So a great time of year to install some rainwater harvesting features. So we're going to talk about basin and swale installations and discuss the difference between those two ideas, considerations for planting, and then also mulching. So there's several ways to harvest rainwater, and here we're going to focus on swales and basins. Swales are generally long and narrow features. They don't have to be long, but narrow, and they're used for conveying water and moving water through your site from A to B. Swales can be really useful if your gutter downspout is not near your basin, or if you need to move water in a direction, maybe across a contour that it doesn't naturally want to go. And they're also really useful if you have a minor slope or a grade to your property and you want to funnel and direct that water to a certain location. In the swale, you can use inorganic mulch, also known as rock, or you can create what we call a bioswale, which includes plants and organic mulch composed of woody debris. And I'll discuss in more detail the pros and cons of different types of mulch to use in your basin. Rocks and cobbles are really good for slowing the water down. So again, if you have a slope on your property, the water's running and you want to make it walk. Using hardscaping can be really useful for that, for dissipating the energy. In this example shown, it's a graphic that one of our collaborators, Plant Collaborative, produced showing the Gutierrez Hubble House open space down in the South Valley. It's highlighting the fast-moving water that's running off of the rooftop. And before we installed this basin that's depicted here, we had a lot of scouring and erosion right at the foot of the rooftop, or sorry, of the porch. So this erosion was degrading the quality of the porch and also causing scouring. So we used a rock-lined swale to mitigate some of that erosion. The swale has a very, very slight slope to it, and it directs the water directly into the basin. So we're moving it away from an area that we had an issue, and then taking that and making it a resource. The basin on the left side of the graphic then collects and holds the water that's directed to it. The water can infiltrate into the ground and supports the plants and the landscape. If you have a deep or narrow basin or a smaller site, you might consider again using rock or cobble to reduce erosion because you may have some steeper walls. And I'll show some examples of that in the next few slides. And then at the bottom of your basin, you want to use organic and woody mulch. The bottom of the basin can be flat, or you could build shallow shelves that create different depths within your basin. And when you're putting plants in, you would want to put the plants that require the most water to be in the deeper parts of the basin, and then less water demanding plants could be located a little bit higher on those shelves or terraces that you constructed. So here is an example of a swale and basin that I helped install in Tucson, Arizona last week at a passive rainwater harvesting workshop. The site is in an apartment housing complex, and it's got a very, very large roof, a very big catchment area, and it's much larger than the site at which we can collect and use that water. So to begin with, the basins are undersized for the area, so we want to include an overflow. That's going to be a really common situation that a lot of folks might find themselves in because we're generally working in retrofits in this type of space. We don't have, we're not starting from scratch, and so we can't build our basins perfectly to accommodate the rainfall events that we may get. Before these basins and swales were installed, the area was heavily eroded. Water came down from the gutters on the right side of the frame, flowed down the slope, carried all the topsoil with it and into the roadway. And it was becoming just a huge nuisance, and also a loss of valuable organic material. So the goal here was to capture some of that water, support the shade trees on that site that already existed, and also to grow some more shade. Earlier, Anthony introduced the idea of site assessment and how do you want to use the space? What are the variables that you want to try and design around or for? And this building is facing west, so it got really, really hot in the afternoon sun. So by bringing that water into the landscape and trying to increase the amount of shade canopy, we're trying to make it a more hospitable place for the residents that live, and that's their back door right there. Lost notes. I jumped ahead a slide. That's why. All right. So to recap here, the swale is directing the water away from the building and into the basin. It's hard to tell in the photos, but there's a couple little rock features that are within that swale, and they help to slow that water down so that we don't increase erosion. And to recap, we're not solving every problem here. We're trying to take advantage of the water that we have and then allowing for that excess water to overflow. So here's the same site. It's collecting water from a different gutter. And I want you to notice the shallow swale that we have right at the sidewalk lip. As water comes down the gutter, it runs across the sidewalk and then steps down. So we're using that rock to act as an armament here so that we don't get down cutting and erosion before water flows down into these basins. And we're using the basins to slow that water down and infiltrate it. As one basin fills, water goes into the next and then into the next. And then this is that same basin shown from a different angle. We're now looking from the downstream side of the basins upwards. There's a few things that I wanted to highlight here that are really useful. On the right side, we have built up these berm walls of the basin, and the key there is that we're using a really gentle slope. We recommend no greater than a 3-to-1 slope. So for every 3 feet your wall goes out, you only want it to rise 1 foot. A really easy way to remember a 3-to-1 slope is if you take your right hand, put it across your chest over your the left side or where your heart is, from your elbow to your wrist is approximately a 3-to-1 slope. And that's what you're trying to aim for when you build up berms and basins. If we exceed that, we kind of risk the chance of erosion and slope failure. If you do, however, have significant slopes in your property, or you have a slight slope and not a lot of space to play with, one thing you can do to transition from a higher elevation to a lower is using rocks. When you're doing rock work, a couple things to keep in mind are to ensure that you have good contact between your rock faces. You don't want water to be able to pass through the space between two rocks because over time, as water flows through, you're going to get erosion and your rock work is going to fail. And then lastly, you always want to account for overflow. As I mentioned, this rooftop in this apartment building is generating a lot more water than we can infiltrate into these basins. So we designed the overflow to go in the same direction that it historically went. We don't want to try and solve a problem and create another one. If you're doing this in your backyard and you are redirecting more water to a landscape than used to go there, consider how you can use that water, how you can keep it on your property for the longest time. Maybe direct your overflow to go towards a tree that's a little further into your property. And then also always remember to be a good neighbor. You don't want to create downstream problems, so don't have that overflow going into your neighbor's property where it's going to cause erosion. Soil sponges can be a really useful tool when you have water that's not infiltrating or soaking into your ground very quickly. The rule of thumb here is that you want water to infiltrate within 24 hours or less. Think about a monsoon event that we get in the summer. We may have a big storm at 3 o'clock one day, and then the next day another storm at 4 o'clock. So you don't want that basin to be full of water. Otherwise, you don't have any capacity for the next day. We've also got mosquitoes that we want to mitigate. So if you do build a pond and you find it not draining well, you don't want to create mosquito habitat. Soil sponges are a really useful way to increase the infiltration rate and capacity of your basin. To install a soil sponge, you really only need a shovel. If you have an auger, even better, but a shovel will do the trick. You essentially want to dig a hole 8 inches wide, 12 inches deep. Imagine that 5-gallon bucket that you get at the home center. That's roughly the size of a really good soil sponge. You then want to backfill that hole with a mixture of soil, compost, mulch, and some pumice stone. And that together is going to be a really carbon-rich mixture that can hold more water than the native soils around it. And also, water always takes the path of least resistance. So if you give water a deep spot to work its way into, it'll then go into that hole and then exfiltrate out into the adjacent soil. So in the same size of a footprint of a basin, you can actually increase the capacity of it by digging a little deeper and adding soil sponges. I'm not going to go too in depth into planting, but I do want to touch on a couple things. So once you've thought about your basin, maybe you've already dug it, there's several considerations you want to take into account. Hopefully, you've already thought about the first one during your site assessment, but I want to really focus. Like, how big is your plant going to be? Consider the mature size of a plant before you put it in the ground. Our plant guides are really useful for that. If you overcrowd your basin, you end up with problems down the road. Other considerations, like, is there a tree nearby that's already providing shade? You wouldn't want to put a plant that needs full sun underneath that, as it might not struggle. So take the time during the site assessment and think about all these small things. When you're going to plant within your basin, some plants want to be adjacent to the water. Some might do okay with slightly saturated soils. So where you plant your basin, where you plant your plants within your basin should be dictated by how they do with standing water. And our plant guides cover that as well. In many residential developments, you may have had fill material that was brought in during the construction of your neighborhood. So you might not be dealing with native soils at this point. And if you want to do any kind of soil amendments, we recommend a 5-to-1 ratio of existing soil to amendment. Native plants don't need many amendments, so we really don't strongly recommend amending your soil dramatically. Only in those cases where you're not really dealing with native soil anymore do we encourage that. And then lastly, when you go to the nursery and you get your plants and you take them out of their containers, be mindful of circling or girdling roots. A lot of nursery plants spend a lot of time in pots. They may start in a small pot and go to a little bigger pot, but their roots are always constrained and they can end up just growing up in circles. And this is especially important for nursery trees. You can have a single girdling root that as the tree grows, it's also growing in a circle and it can kill the tree over time. So to alleviate this, you can take a shovel, a knife, but you just want to break up those roots and then fan them out in your hole when you go to plant. So I briefly discussed two kinds of mulch so far, organic and inorganic. Organic mulch is any type of plant material. It's ideally going to be shredded woody material that's been partially composted. We recommend using a depth of 3 to 4 inches on the bottom of your basin with organic mulch. And this is going to do multiple things. First off, it's going to suppress the growth of annual weeds. It's also going to retain more moisture in your soil. It creates it essentially shades the soil from the sun, so you don't have that solar radiation driving evaporative loss. You also can increase your soil microbiome. So those fungi and bacteria that are in our healthy soils, you're going to increase the habitat for them to grow with organic mulch. In contrast, inorganic mulch or rock mulch doesn't provide a lot of great growing conditions for your basin. It's great to move water through because it's durable, but for plants, it retains heat really, really well. This is going to drive evaporation and stress your plants. And over time, if you have a rock mulch with any type of weed barrier underneath it, wind is going to blow in sediment and it's going to fill those little cracks between the space and it's going to sit on top of that landscaping fabric, creating a perfect habitat for weeds. So we really only recommend rock mulch for in your swales when you're moving water from A to B. And then also it can be really useful as a landscaping tool to create, neat borders and clean edges, but it should not be the primary surface for your basins. In this final section of the presentation, I'm going to touch on care and maintenance. The goal for passive rainwater harvesting features is to be self-sustaining. Ideally, after a couple of years of establishment, you should be able to walk away and this landscape will take care of itself. You'll have a little bit of weeding, some watering during establishment, and the littlest bit of pruning, but really pruning should be minimal. So with regards to watering, it's important to note the goal here is to minimize supplemental irrigation. By choosing native and desert adapted plants that we have on all of our planting lists, you can create a really beautiful landscape in your rainwater harvesting basin that requires little to no irrigation. However, watering will be required for plant establishment and during periods of drought. This is a rain-driven system, and so if we do find ourselves in August and we haven't gotten our monsoon rains yet, you're going to want to be using a little bit of supplemental irrigation. I've included a chart here on the left side of the slide that shows typical plant establishment periods, the time it takes for plants to grow roots at which they can then collect all the water they need. During those first couple years, they're going to need a little bit of supplemental irrigation. So your perennials and grasses, plan on giving them water for the first few years, shrubs for 3 to 5 years. And then, as Amos mentioned, trees are our most valuable asset. They provide so much habitat and shade and just make being outdoors so much more enjoyable. So we really want to invest in them. And that's going to require a decade or 15 years of supplemental irrigation. You may not need to have that irrigation on all the time during that period, especially if we have, a wet winter and a good monsoon. But being aware of that and planning for it is going to increase the likelihood for long-term tree health. Hand watering or using drip irrigation, either is going to work great. Drip irrigation is useful if you're forgetful, you don't have the time to go water. If you like spending time in your garden and you want to hand water, it's the most efficient way to get water to your plants. You're never going to have a leak in the system if you're hand watering. So I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I will direct you to the Water Authority's Irrigation Efficiency Guide. Richard Peirce presented on that recently. It's such a good resource, and you can find that at 505outside.com. And then moving on to pruning. I want to emphasize it should be minimal. Pruning should be minimal. I want everyone to celebrate their sense of place, appreciate the amazing desert adapted plant communities we have in our region. We don't need to shape everything to look like a lollipop or a beach ball. So going back to our discussion on site assessment, if you plan for how big your plant's going to be at maturity, you can avoid a lot of the issues of overcrowding, which then leads people to pruning. So again, consult your local plant lists, understand the mature size of a plant that you're putting in the ground, and plan for that. If you were to prune a tree, removing the limbs and the leaves can be really stressful on the plant. You're essentially taking off solar collectors from that plant, and they need to be able to collect the carbon in order to grow healthy roots. And so by pruning it, you're just reducing the strength of the tree. I use this graphic on the right side just to kind of highlight the idea that trees and plants as well, they're always shading their roots. And so the form that they grow in is usually intentional from the plant's perspective. So if you go and lop off part of the canopy, you're now going to increase the solar radiation that's hitting the ground. You're going to stress out those roots that are in that area, and you're going to drive more evaporative loss from the system. For your grasses and your shrubs, consider leaving the dead growth from the previous season in place through the winter. Maybe in the spring, then you go back and you prune some of that previous growth back. It's not needed, but if you like the way that looks, wait until the spring to do it. In the meantime, during the winter, it's going to provide textural and color interest in your yard, and the seed heads are also going to provide food and habitat for wildlife. So if I had to summarize this topic in just a couple words, it would be do less. Don't try and solve a problem that doesn't really exist. Let your plants grow. And then I'll pass it over to Anthony, and he's going to talk about another example project.
All right. Yes, we just wanted to highlight a workshop installation that Bernalillo County and many other partners helped make happen earlier this year. I thought it was a great experience. It was in the International District, and we worked with a homeowner who was interested in better utilizing the water that was running off of her flat roof and spitting out of the canale. And she did have a sloped yard, so even though she did a lot to build up her soil and act as a sponge to infiltrate that water, we thought that, well, if we added swales, basins, we could massively increase the amount of water that is retained in that on that yard and infiltrating to support her already establishing trees. So, I just wanted to highlight this project because it was a fairly big yard. It used to be a Bermuda grass lawn, and so it was a pretty expansive area. And to do that project by herself, I mean, she was a busy person. It might have taken her all year what we did in 4 hours, this group of people here. So we collaborated with a lot of partners, including the Trumbull Village Neighborhood Association, the South San Pedro Neighborhood Association, got some people together. And at the end of just a 4 hour day in March, we had created this now, hopefully, very aesthetically pleasing and very functional resource that's going to help her trees long term take advantage, and not just trees, shrubs, grasses too. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share this out to encourage you all to get with your neighborhood association, get with your friends, garden club, whatever it is, and maybe you can all cost share a workshop at one person's house, move on to the next person, because with many hands, it really does make light work. And if every house did this in Albuquerque, we would be really rocking and rolling with our water conservation efforts, and like I said, so many other benefits. Oh, and at the end, you can see on the picture, she's holding her Albuquerque Backyard Refuge Program sign because we installed some native plants during this rainwater harvesting project. She got her yard certified through the Albuquerque Backyard Refuge Program, which I also encourage everybody who owns or rents in Albuquerque to check that program out and consider participating. All right, one last plug for our burnco.gov/rainwater sites. Here's just some of our important partners at the bottom there that helped produce these resources. Like we said, we couldn't go into depth on everything, but I use this guide all the time, even if it's just like looking up like what's the slope supposed to be on my swale again? Totally consult these resources. They're there for free. So that is that. And lastly, we'll leave some contact information, and that's pretty much all we had for you.